writer, visual artist, lawyer, and advocate for women's health and safety based on Darug land. Amani's debut memoir, The Mother Wound, received the 2022 Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Nonfiction. She's also a former Archibald Prize finalist, the recipient of the 2021 UTS Faculty of Law Alumni Award, and she was Local Woman of the Year for Bankstown at the 2020 New South Wales Premier's Woman of the Year Awards, in recognition of her advocacy against domestic violence. Amani currently consults with government and non-government organisations on improving access and outcomes for victim survivors of violence. Welcome, Amani.
Thank you, Randa, and thanks for having me.
Pleasure.
Welcome to Two Pals in a Pod. I gotta say, mashallah, after that bio. Amani, we live on Indigenous stolen land. We're beneficiaries of settlement, but we're also victim survivors of Western imperialism and racial capitalism. So we like to start each episode not just by asking your origin story, your asl, your roots, but by also acknowledging whose land do you live, love, fight, and protest on.
So I live, work, and raise my children on Darug land, and I sincerely pay my respects to the traditional owners of that land and their elders, past and present. And I'm trying to raise my children in a way where they're cognizant of their existence on this land as settlers, which is quite different to the migrant mindset that our parents came to this country with, which was perhaps a little bit less conscious of that. My parents arrived in Australia in the 70s and 80s. They came from the south of Lebanon, from a village called Aitaron. Aitaron was occupied at the time that they left it, and the occupation continued until Israel withdrew in the year 2000, and I actually remember the celebrations at that time. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean that the threat of colonisation and the ongoing violence just stopped after that point. Since then, there are regular air incursions, illegal encroachments on our land. They entered the outskirts of our village during the current genocide. And the broader regional effects of Israel's violence and colonisation just have a profound impact on my community. And unfortunately, they continue to also destabilise Lebanon as a whole. So it's never seemed fully realistic for us to be able to go back, even though my parents were always saying when we were younger, oh, we'll go back one day, we'll go back before you're 13, we'll go back before you're 20. And that just never materialised because of that ongoing instability and threat of violence. Yeah.
Amani, we want to talk about gender and feminism today and what feminism means to you at this time, and putting that into context of the genocide, but also the gendered impact of that genocide, where we have statistics. I think they've extrapolated from the Lancet Review, which is one of the most prestigious British journals, that about 434,000 people have been killed, and 70% of them are women and children. The impact of the genocide on women in particular, the health infrastructure, 150,000 pregnant women have been impacted, the lack of baby formula, and in fact the deliberate blockade of baby formula, as we can see, escalate with the current escalation of the starvation campaign, the strategic starvation. Reports of sexual violence, including rape, committed by Israeli forces. So when we ask you what does feminism mean to you at this time, I guess we're trying to ask, how do you see the difference between mainstream white feminism and a race-critical, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist feminism as a way, as a praxis for us to make sense of what's happening?
So before I answer that, I'd preface it with what actually brings me to this advocacy in the first place, and then the connections between those things then inform how I respond to your question. I started advocating against domestic violence and other forms of interpersonal violence after losing my mum to domestic violence in 2015. She was one of about 83 women in Australia, or so-called Australia, who lost their lives violently that year. And my mum had lost her mum in an act of violence committed by Israel. So my grandmother was killed in 2006 in an Israeli war crime that targeted a civilian convoy that was evacuating our village during the war that took place that year. For me, those two violences are very much connected, both in the power dynamic that led to those acts of violence, but also in the consequences, the grief and the long-term challenges around healing from that violence. And of course, my mother's loss shaped the way that she parented as well. So when I advocate as a feminist for women, I'm being driven by both of these experiences, lived experiences of violence, and I can't separate one from the other. And so when I think about feminism, I think about the Western or white feminism that really looks at superficial indicators of equality, superficial indicators of women's representation, things that to me seem tokenistic if we're not contending with actual power structures, if we're not contending with the policies that shape women's lives, if we're not contending with the role that our governments in the West play in the destabilisation and displacement of women elsewhere. So whilst feminism broadly is a way of viewing the world in order to identify inequalities, violence, and disadvantages that affect women's lives, I think that is an incomplete lens to apply if you're not also taking a race-critical lens, if you're not also conscious of the impacts of colonisation and imperialism on women of the global, well, they call it the global south, but we're calling it the global majority from now on, right? So women of the global majority have political aspirations. They have contended with patriarchy in very creative and strong ways. They resist in really powerful ways. They have much to teach us about feminism, but they have been dismissed. And the only times that Western or white feminism consider the needs of women of the global majority is when it's in the interests of foreign policy.
Correct.
Or when they could be framed as people who could be saved, or when they're framed or othered as women who represent some sort of threat to their own lives, to the lives of Western women, whether that's through bearing babies and sort of swamping our communities with children, or whether it's this like framing of us as mothers of terrorists or enablers of violent men, or all of these really insidious narratives that you have around Arab and Muslim women and women of the global majority more broadly. So for me, the difference lies in understanding that a meaningful feminism needs to be anti-racist. It needs to understand that Muslim and Arab women are navigating patriarchy at the same time as they are navigating Islamophobia, at the same time as they are navigating racism, at the same time as they are resisting all of these different violent forces in their lives, from the lives within the domestic sphere and all the way out to protesting against the actions of our governments, protesting against the invasions of their homelands, protesting against the displacement of their sisters elsewhere.
Yeah, so it's not just that it's a blind spot with white mainstream feminism, is it? It's that like imperial feminism strikes at the core of what white mainstream feminism is about. And as you were talking, I was starting to like remember things and be triggered. Like, for example, when Laura Bush, George Bush's wife, took his traditional slot on radio to call for an invasion of Afghanistan to save women from the Taliban. Or I remember when you were mentioning about radicalization and the whole hysteria around that, there were actual training sessions that were targeting mothers in the Muslim community about how to monitor their child's online activity and putting the onus on them. As you know, having to surveil their own children who are on this path to radicalization. I mean, there are so many examples. There's a litany of examples of how complicit and how white mainstream feminism is an alibi to colonialism and imperialism.
And if I can add on the flip side, all the ways in which you've outlined that we are used as a cover or a shield for those precise interests. Yeah. Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. So there's a point in my book where I talk about immediately after losing my grandmother, I'm a teenager, I'm engaging with the media, I'm trying to understand how to really process these events. Okay, and I remember at the time it was Hillary Clinton who came out and said that Israel had a right to defend itself. And whilst sitting with the grief and the violence of what had just happened to my family, I couldn't understand how someone who was elevated as a symbol of empowered Western womanhood at the same time had this hypocrisy, as I perceived it then, that disregarded the consequences of her own words for women like my grandmother. And then I came to understand that this wasn't just a hypocrisy. This is not just a blind spot. This is by design. Yeah. When we resist these forms of violence, we represent a threat to empire. We represent a threat to Western ways of knowing and doing things, and the types of ideas that they wish to impose on the rest of the world and that they wish to profit from. And we need to get very real about the ways that feminism has been used historically, not just in recent times, but used to further colonial agendas from its very inception. Because if you're living in an environment where the power structures are continuously pursuing the next invasion of the next place or the next foreign incursion onto someone else's land, then they're going to weaponize any tool that is available to them, any powerful tool that is available to them in order to achieve their goals. So something like feminism cannot be fully neutral at all in that kind of context, because it's going to be weaponized by the elites, and it's going to be used to cause harm. It's going to be used to further their agenda. And when we say we, I think feminists who live and work in the West or participate in any kind of advocacy in these spaces need to really understand that there is no neutrality around their feminism, and that we need to expand our understanding of what feminism is, expand our understanding of its history and the negative consequences that it has had for other people. And without doing that, we just have this really vague collection of ideas that lends itself to being used to commit harm.
It's not just in Western countries. I think the specifics of being on stolen land is the perfect example because of the stolen generation. Like, what more example do you need of the savior mission, the civilizing mission being done by women to women in the domestic sphere? And we don't even need to reach to the Afghanistan or the Middle East and all that. Yeah, it's right here as a training ground for understanding how it's used as a tool to crush, black and brown bodies and lives.
Absolutely. And I think whilst some people will pay lip service to that fact, there's not been a real reckoning with the role of feminism in the colonisation of this land. We know that there are missing and murdered Aboriginal women whose deaths never received proper investigation, whose families were told things like, oh, maybe she just went walkabout. You can read the work of Dr. Amy Maguire. You can look at the work that a lot of Indigenous activists and feminists have been doing on this land to draw attention to the fact that feminism does not serve them. Feminism in its Australian manifestation has not been designed in a way that serves them. It's designed in a way that further represses and dehumanises Aboriginal women and mothers in particular. Women die in custody regularly. Women end up being misidentified as the aggressor when they call the police to report abuse. So when they reach out for help, they also don't receive that help. Their babies are taken. We think of the stolen generation as a historical fact, but babies continue to be removed from their families when mothers reach out for help. So I think that's exactly right. I think we don't need to look too far to find examples of the ways that feminism can sometimes inform policy and inform practice, government practice, in a way that is extremely harmful, and it's not always an unintended consequence. We have to really see that these things are often by design.
Yes, and it has sustained these carceral logics in a way. You suffered the unimaginable, losing your mother in such a brutal act of domestic violence. And your book, The Mother Wound, is multi-award winning. It is a searing, exceptionally crafted memoir. I'd like to ask you about the title, which takes its name from the theory that the mother wound, the relationship between mothers and daughters, is affected by unhealed, traumatic experiences passed down matriarchal lines. And if you can also talk us through how the mother wound is grounded in a race-critical, anti-imperialist, anti-colonial feminism.
Yeah, so I came across the concept of the mother wound when I was sort of in this recovery stage. I had a lot of PTSD after losing my mum, and I spent a lot of time on Instagram reading popular psychology type material.
Yeah. And we've all been there.
Yeah. And I came across this concept, and it really, really interested me. I thought about, okay, isn't this fascinating that this kind of trauma can be passed on, the idea that it can be passed on intergenerationally and matrilineally through families. And it appealed to me because at the time that I lost my mum, I was 5 months pregnant with my own first child. And so I was really thinking about intergenerational trauma. How do we stop it? And what power do I have as an individual to intervene if these forces that damaged my mum's life and damaged my grandmother's life are so beyond my power to influence? I really felt that there was this sense that violence was inescapable for a woman like me, because then I had the evidence, right? Two generations of women who'd been killed and murdered in really oppressive circumstances. So thinking about that, and then thinking about this concept of a mother wound, and thinking about the individual versus the structural, really provided me with the groundwork for my book. And it gave me this concept to play with a little bit, because I went beyond just the interpersonal understanding of a mother wound that's used in psychology and therapy, where you kind of like examine what went wrong between me and my mum. And I thought, well, what about the wounds that take place more figuratively across the globe? What caused my mum to be displaced in the first place? What created the vulnerabilities and the risk factors in her life? And I realised that at the heart of that was the experience of having her land colonised and the flow-on effects of that. And so in telling my mum's story, I knew I wanted to tell my grandmother's story, but at first it felt like they were two separate things. But then as I had these breakthroughs, I began to understand, no, you've got to sort of trace it right back. And so that initial wound is the wound of our lands being carved up, right? These arbitrary borders, they're the wound.
It always comes back to Sykes-Picot. These bastards.
Right?
Yep.
So the original wound, the wound that all the other wounds kind of sit in, was really that in this story. And so I played with that idea, and the wounds that are physical and immediate, as well as those historical wounds. And I think that helped me build a narrative where it was clear that you can't have my mother's story without also paying attention to my grandmother's story. And we know that stories like my grandmother's stories are not often platformed, are not even given much mainstream attention. And when my grandmother was killed, my mum advocated for her publicly and spoke about what had happened. But that was through the efforts of the remaining survivors of the family, and through immense grief that she did that, and it still didn't lead to structural change or any kind of impact on a meaningful scale. So I really felt the responsibility of telling that story whilst making those connections clear, that you can't resolve interpersonal violence without looking at the big forms of violence that we allow to take place that are legal, that we allow to occur every day, that our governments participate in.
What do you mean legal? Like, unpack that one.
So when an example of where violence is legal is during war. Yeah. Obviously, we have rules of war and things like that, but if someone is collateral or deemed collateral, their death is not ever the subject of any accountability processes. There's no real understanding of the injustice of that death. thinking about this concept of collateral versus thinking about how a victim survivor of violence, domestic violence, is treated. If they're an Arab or Muslim woman and they're a victim of interpersonal violence, all of a sudden their death opens up this conversation about, oh, look at those men and they're so violent and what ideology informs this, et cetera, et cetera. But when we're collateral, nobody wants to ask those questions. Nobody wants a proper investigation. Nobody wants accountability. Nobody wants the story even told.
And so terminology is sort of weaponized and used again to sustain in a way. And I mean, we could have a whole episode, and we will, about the laws and limitations and the way it's weaponized. But I'm really interested in how here it is used, as you said earlier, to further repress. It doesn't serve. It's actually used. It doesn't serve the communities. It's actually used in service to further repress.
Absolutely. And when these conversations take place, they kind of take on a life of their own, and the families are left out of that conversation. I don't see there's always an assumption that there's something less. When I spoke to people about my story, I felt that there was this sort of assumption or this dismissal that my grandmother's death was somehow less violent because it happened in this detached, impersonal way. I actually think that when the forces of the world collaborate to kill people in their own streets, that is a very profound violence. That is extremely personal to me. And I wanted that to come through as well, because we do depersonalize the deaths of the people who we don't see as human. And resisting that means telling their story and insisting on justice for them in the same way that we would insist for justice in the circumstances of domestic violence. So there are so many different ways to look at it, and making those connections between this large-scale violence and small-scale violence was a crucial part of telling that story. Connecting the macro with the micro was a really important thing for me to do, and the refusal to allow people to see my grandmother's death as less significant because she was over there, or less important because we can't control it. That's just what happens in war. You'd be shocked at the number of people who say things like that. You probably wouldn't be shocked.
It does kind of, it is almost like giving permission to kill domestically when there is no accountability for killing, on the global stage, in other countries, in the name of war, in the name of whatever excuse.
Yeah.
Which kind of brings us to the next question, which is like what I've learned this from you. You gave a talk at Macquarie University, and it was just so illuminating to finally listen to somebody who was able to take like quite conventional feminist concepts, such as Darvo, such as coercive control, and map that onto the colonial and map that onto state-sanctioned violence as a paradigm for understanding that kind of violence. Can you take us through those concepts, particularly with reference to what Israel is doing as possibly, and Western powers, the biggest coercive controllers on the world stage at the moment?
Yeah, so we've gained a greater understanding in this colony of what coercive control means over the past few years, because a lot of advocates have suggested that it really underpins the majority of the lethal acts of violence that we see. It is present in almost every murder. Whilst physical violence might not be there, some kind of coercive control tends to exist in the pattern of a relationship before a fatal act of violence takes place. So coercive control is about looking at those patterns of violence, the power dynamics, the structure of the relationship, who was exercising what tactics of control. And that helps us then identify the real victim, the primary victim. And it helps us also understand who the primary aggressor is. So the language of coercive control can be quite helpful for understanding power dynamics more generally as well. And I think they are so clear when it comes to the actions of Israel and the experiences of Palestinians. And one of the things that our understandings of coercive control encourage us to consider is that violence doesn't occur in isolated incidents. We need to take a broader lens and understand historical context. We need to understand the overarching power dynamic in a particular situation to be able to understand who the true victim is. So I feel that even though that kind of terminology is broadly accepted in feminist spaces in so-called Australia, it was not immediately applied or understood in relation to the violence that we watched unfold in Gaza in October 2023. It was not applied as a potential tool or framework for intervening on behalf of, not in a savioristic way, but actually speaking out for Palestinian women who we recognised and knew were at risk immediately. We know exactly how the pattern goes. We know when Israel is about to say, see what you made me do, right? Yeah. We know when Israel is about to misidentify the aggressor and employ those Davo tactics, deny, attack, reverse victim and offender, etc. And we saw so many instances of that aided and abetted by our media. And it was kind of astounding to me to see people suspend that knowledge in that moment when I felt that we had made some headway in understanding the framework of coercive control, and where I had an expectation that people would be able to make those connections like really easily and naturally.
It's insane, isn't it? Because like these same people who have like such a prominent platform as feminists, you know, are like so vocal about the way that people get manipulated and seduced into thinking that, you know, the abuser in a relationship is like his image is sanitized. He always comes up with an excuse. You know, the way that he's presented in the media after he's killed his partner always focuses on him. You know, we would never have thought that about him. He was a good guy. And they were unable to push past that and think, are you questioning how you are excusing Israel in this same way, and you are exonerating Israel because you have a perception of what Israel represents, and you can't push past that to see actually they are the abuser here?
Absolutely. And they had access to the institutions and tools that they needed to engage in that denial and that attack. We know that in the case of domestic violence, for example, an abuser tends to have a lot more access to the family courts. They can often afford lawyers, even if their partner cannot. They may have had exclusive control of bank accounts, assets. They may have had access to powerful people. There are examples of abusers having access to the police directly, obtaining personal details about their victims, influencing proceedings, etc. So we know that the more powerful party, the primary aggressor, tends to have a way of being able to manipulate institutions in their favour. The resources they need.
Yes.
Exactly.
There's an imbalance.
Exactly.
Management.
Yeah.
Exactly. So when we look at that imbalance of power and apply that to Israel, we can also see a similar pattern where the types of organisations and institutions and resources that were being leveraged to manufacture consent for genocide were very clear in those early days. We knew when we looked at the New York Times, we knew when we looked at various outlets and the way that they were constructing the narrative, that this was the abuser logic coming through. We knew that these tactics were designed to make us, to make Palestinians, to make anyone who spoke up alongside Palestinians, to make people with lived experience of Israeli aggression seem like they lacked credibility, seemed like that they were biased, they had some sort of alternate agenda, etc., etc., etc. And the same thing happens to women in the family courts. The same thing happens to women when they complain against their abuser. They find themselves up against a system that is not reading the power dynamics and that is seeing them as lacking credibility.
I remember thinking about this when there was a lot of, well, there's always a lot of, Zionist lobby sort of indignation about being hated. How dare they hate us? They hate, we feel unsafe. But even beyond the unsafe, it's indignation. How dare Palestinians hate us? like this interpersonal, and it reminds me of those abusers, like, how dare you as my partner hate me? It's like they can't even see that their actions make them so appalling in the eyes of their partner. Then not only do they demand the right to abuse, they demand the right to be loved as they abuse.
Absolutely.
Absolved.
And absolutely, the eternal approval of the victim and the society around the victim is really important to the abuser, because that's what enables the abuse. This perception that I can do no wrong allows and emboldens abusers to do whatever it is that they want. And they benefit from that profoundly. And again, that's another thing that we miss when we don't read the power dynamics correctly.
The dehumanization of Palestinians en masse, we know, is fundamental to Israel's genocidal colonial project. And the manifestation of the tactics, some of that you've mentioned now, I mean, nowhere are they more apparent than in, I would say, media. The whole exonerative dialects that have been developed, the headlines. We see the adultification of children, media reports referring to children being killed as young women or young men. Sky News reporting the killing of a 3-4-year-old young lady, which boggles the mind. And then there's, of course, the reduction of women as to, the status of victims only, robbed of their agency. And we know that, okay, on the one hand, women and children are statistically the largest victims of Israel's genocide, but also that the framing of Palestinian women simply as victims erases our, critical contributions to the anti-colonial struggle, our vital roles in the First Intifada, the Second Intifada, in the Unity Uprising in Gaza in 2021, and so on. On the other hand, you also have the dehumanization of men, which I think, is quite distinct and different, and we wanted to ask you about that because there's a tension between, drawing attention to the genocide's impact on women and children. They're not seen as militants. They embody, that perfect victim civilian mentality. They're afforded innocence, so to speak. But on the other hand, what about the Palestinian men? Their grief, their murder, their torture, their resistance, their love for their families. How do we, as race-critical feminists, negotiate these tensions?
So how do we talk about men? How do we talk about men when we know that men do all these different things and they're not necessarily innocent? How do we talk about men in a way that creates accountability? We are having conversations in Australia around men's behaviour change. We've been talking about the impacts of adverse childhood experiences on people's propensity to commit acts of violence later in life. Those adverse childhood experiences include a myriad of traumas. It can be from having witnessed domestic violence themselves or having grown up with a chronically traumatic environment, being displaced, being subjected to any kind of abuse themselves, etc. We know that we cannot stop or prevent future violence, and this is in the domestic violence context, without addressing the ways in which adverse childhood experiences affect men and boys. And there has been a push in recent times to encourage us to, when we speak about the perpetration of violence on the interpersonal level, to understand that you're not dealing with monsters, you're not dealing with people who are an anomaly, you're dealing with people who have a long history, and that history informs their perpetration. We don't get anywhere when we dehumanize the perpetrators of violence in the DV context. We don't get anywhere when we talk about their violence in isolation from the broader society that creates and leads to those experiences of violence that then create and lead to the experiences of women's violence when they interact with these men. Unfortunately, when it comes to Arab and Muslim men, these narratives about rehumanizing them, understanding the ways in which their lives are affected by a multitude of factors, we're not afforded, our sons, our brothers, we're not afforded that kind of level of empathy or humanization. when I went to write about my dad's atrocious crime, which was extremely violent, I had to navigate the terrain of wanting to call out his behaviour and hold him accountable for it and make it inexcusable without further dehumanising Arab and Muslim men. And that means we recognise that we're not just talking about gender, as we said at the start of this conversation, we're talking about racism as well. We're talking about the intersection of those things in Muslim women's lives. Because of the racist environment and the racist frameworks that have informed conversations around Muslim and Arab men, people are so ready to vilify them. They're so ready to see them as this irredeemable cohort of people who don't have individual drivers, don't have individual experiences. And so I was very conscious in the wake of October 23 and at the start of the genocide, the ways in which these really racist narratives about men and boys were being leveraged to manufacture consent for the genocide, and at the same time would continue to be used. It was foreseeable, would continue to be used throughout the genocide to make it seem like, you know, Palestinian and Muslim women have something to gain if they cooperate with the powers of the West, if they just allow us to rescue them, if they just allow us to remove these tyrants that dictate their lives. And it's continued. And we know that Muslim and Arab men and boys in this country are overrepresented in the prison population. We know that Indigenous men are highly overrepresented in the prison population and are seen as somehow more violent than men generally. And this is a very racist construct that's been sort of perpetuated by media narratives and just the history of violence in this continent towards Aboriginal women. When in a really significant number of cases, the violence that Aboriginal women are experiencing is from white partners. So when we talk about the intersections between sexism and racism, we get a much more complete picture of the influences that shape people's lives, the ways in which violence is connected, and that gives us a clue for how we prevent violence. So I'm interested in men as preventative, as agents of prevention. When we have the opportunity for men to grow up in safe environments, free from racial violence, free from colonization, free from poverty, and free from displacement from their homelands, we have a much better outcome for everyone. And we can't sort of separate that. We can't separate the effects of male violence on women's lives from the ways that other violence affects men. It's this loop that we're going to be caught in forever if we don't grapple with racism and colonial logic.
Do you think we're too late? Because I we are at a point where life has become so cheap. Every single day we are seeing Gaza as an abattoir, like just mass slaughter. So the desensitization to the sanctity of life. What does that mean for us here? You know, what not only in terms of the desensitization to violence here, and the numbing of people to any shock about that violence, but what does it mean for Arab and Muslim and, you know, black and brown bodies here to see their lives seen as so dispensable, so worthless?
And if I can add to that, in this context in particular as well, the tendency to adopt these single issue advocacy themes, I suppose, and also have a scarcity mindset. It's really difficult to operate in a space that is constantly pushing that mindset, I think.
Absolutely. And the best advocates I know in the domestic violence space are those who are also outspoken about racism. We're not single issue advocates because we're not single issue people. And it is dehumanizing to see us as single issue people. It is dehumanizing to take our experiences and use them to further white supremacist responses to violence in our communities. It is dehumanizing to take our experiences and our stories and use them to feed into policies that we don't necessarily agree with, that don't feel authentic or safe for us. So that's a really important point. I think in relation to what you were saying about, is it too late? I think it's too late for some people to redeem themselves at this point, but I don't think it's too late given that we have really powerful forms of feminist resistance coming from within Palestinian communities. If you look at the work of the Palestinian Feminist Collective, which then inspired the local versions of our advocacy here, if you look at the ways that mothers resist genocide, if you look at the ways that Palestinian women speak out about their experiences, their testimonies, I do not think it's too late for those kinds of things to really take root in a transformative way for feminists around the world. And people who want to ignore those narratives, who want to ignore those testimonies, who want to ignore those examples of powerful resistance, I don't believe they're genuinely interested in the liberation of women.
I think they do it at their own peril, because it's a boomerang effect, as we all say. What is happening in Gaza is an audition for the rest of the world.
Yes.
And when you see the mass slaughter of people with no accountability, with such impunity, don't think for a second it's not going to come back here.
I agree.
And it betrays their own legacy.
Absolutely.
Frankly.
Betrays their own legacy, betrays their own literature. And I bet that abusers who are sitting at home watching Israel act with impunity every single day are emboldened by that. There is no way that that is humanizing women to them. There is no way that that makes them respect
Law.
the sanctity of life or law or any of the things that we hold dear or that we rely on.
Amani, we like to end off our episodes with a couple of rapid fire segments, moments of levity that we're all really needing at the moment. Is there a quote, a poem, a verse, a piece of writing that's been anchoring you lately, especially at this?
I think there's one that came to mind because of its relevance to this conversation, and I feel that it's important, again, for people to connect this because it speaks about interpersonal abuse, but it also really resonates with me in relation to structural violence. And it's from Dr. Judith Herman, who wrote Trauma and Recovery. And in there, she says, "It is very tempting to take the side of the perpetrator. All the perpetrator asks is that the bystander do nothing. He appeals to the universal desire to see, hear, and speak no evil. The victim, on the contrary, asks the bystander to share the burden of pain. The victim demands action, engagement, and remembering." And so that's my a reminder for myself and for other feminists doing this work around the importance of refusing to be that bystander, refusing to be that person whose belief systems and whose existence is used by the abuser to further their harm.
Our next question is there something you're no longer apologizing for as a woman, as an Arab, as a Muslim, someone who speaks on Palestine?
I'm trying really hard
Not to name and shame.
but I don't think I've ever apologized for it, but I'm trying really hard to get better at making other people uncomfortable when I'm speaking about my experiences. I'm trying hard to be more explicit about the effects of colonization on my people and to be more explicit about the importance of resistance because I think we've seen that there's been a bit of a lag in the dialogue and people have been sort of catching up and it feels like, well, maybe we should have been clearer about this beforehand. Not blaming myself, but I don't want to feel apologetic at all for that. I'm also no longer apologising for calling out the people who failed us in those early days. I reached out to several women's media organisations in relation to publishing Feminists for a Free Palestine, the statement that a few of us were involved in putting together that really almost, to be honest, the way that it foreshadowed what would happen is spine-tingling really because it was accurate and it was unfortunately really on point in that regard. And yet we were ignored or told that it would be too inconvenient or too difficult to publish or that people had policies against it. Different organisations tried to sort of issue either very weak statements that were really neutralising, or avoided it altogether because of those narratives that were taking place at that time. So I don't want to find myself in the future ever feeling like I need to be apologising for calling that out.
Yeah, I mean, we could, again, have a whole other episode on accountability and how do we move forward with some of those organizations.
Revenge and shame.
Not a bad way to start. Well, I mean, this is all about receipts and rage and, care packages. So if you could send our listeners a feminist care package to get through these times, what would be in it?
This is so hard, but I love an unsolicited bunch of flowers and books. So I'd be sending your listeners a couple of your books, some flowers, something to really seek comfort from. And I think that engagement with Palestinian stories is can be such an empowering way to participate in these conversations, and is really essential if people are ready to sort of reframe the way that they're thinking about their work in other areas, including the domestic violence space.
Amani, thank you so much for speaking to us today on Two Pals in a Pod.
Thank you so much for having me.